Hello and welcome to this series of classes on German literature in translation, the Nobel Prize winners, all 11 of them. Today we're going to be talking about Paul Heyse. Paul Heyse, who? Oh dear, nobody talks about him anymore, not even in German studies. He's a voice that's disappeared into the past. And maybe that's what should have happened with Paul Heyse's voice. Who knows? I'm not going to try and decide on that here. You can if you want to. But why didn't Kafka get this prize? Why does posterity sometimes judge so differently from the present? It certainly did in the case of Heyse. Nowadays, like I said, he's not really regarded as any kind of a force in German literature at all, unless it is perhaps to call him the last of the great realist narrators of the 19th century. That claim has been made about him. But it makes us wonder, doesn't it? Is anybody going to still be talking about some of the great artists of today? Will anybody still talk about The Weeknd or Kanye West or Cardi B in 150 years' time? And anyway, does it really matter? Maybe it doesn't. So today our job is going to be to try to understand a little bit about Paul Heyse, about the times that he lived, and what might have led him to write this story that you're reading today, La Rabiata, the angry person, or as it's translated into English, the fury. So who was Paul Heyse? He was born in 1830 in Berlin, and he was born into an age known as the Age of Restoration. The Vienna Congress had ended the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, and it had created the so-called German Bund, the German Association of States, with its 39 member states. The Age of Restoration saw strong attempts to restore the political status quo to what it had been before the French Revolution, that is, before 1789. Why before the French Revolution? Because that was the time when governments could more or less rely on the authority of the church and the state. Now, this had been challenged vigorously and vehemently by many Enlightenment thinkers, and there's a good reason to say that it was the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, that brought the downfall of the French monarchy in the French Revolution. Now, governments throughout Europe were very concerned in the wake of the French Revolution that they might suffer the same fate, that the movements of reason against authority could very well lead to their downfall. And so we can recognize a growing conservatism in this period. It's a conservatism that wants to rely on authority, the authority of the church, the authority of the state. More, actually, the authority of the state than the authority of the church. That seemed to be dwindling anyway. And alongside this growing conservative movement, we have growing strivings for democracy, for the voices of the masses to be heard. So if we look at the legacy of the Enlightenment around the middle of the 19th century, then we find that there is an emphasis on personal liberty, there's an emphasis on the constitutional state, and there's also an emphasis on the free economy. And at the same time, we've got a growing democratic movement that wants to focus on the voice of the majority being heard in government. And the way this is going to happen, first of all, is through universal franchise, the universal right to vote, universal suffrage. And we're going to be coming back to this point a little bit later on. So just bear it in mind. Political movements around the time when Paul Heyse is born are focused on the question of restoring authority of the state, restoring the authority of the church, perhaps, versus the movements towards universal suffrage, the movements towards the right to vote. And when we come back to this, then we're going to be talking about one possible way into understanding what he's writing about in La Rabiata, in The Fury. So this period of German history restoration, it's also known as Vor März, which literally means before March. You're going to be learning a little bit of German in this course, even though it is a course on German literature in translation, so you can memorize these terms if you want to. Vor März, before March. And why March? Because March 1848 was when the so-called March Revolution took place in Germany. The March Revolution was the time of National Assembly in Frankfurt, the attempt to write a unifying constitution for the German state, and attempts to introduce universal suffrage. Universal suffrage, the universal vote, we have to put in parentheses, meant the vote for men. Now in 1848, Paul Heyse was in Berlin. He'd only just finished high school and he had started studying the classics. And he, as a young student, was swept up by the passion and the enthusiasm for the democratic movements in Germany at the time. There were barricades in the streets of Berlin. The military was called out. And this was followed by a whole year of attempts to really establish democratic processes in Germany, throughout Germany. Eventually it was going to fail. One speaks of the failed revolution of Germany, the failed bourgeois revolution. The Germans couldn't do what the French tried to do, but the attempts were important. Heyse gradually distanced himself from the political movements of the day, following this initial enthusiasm. In 1852 he completed his PhD on Italian literature, and he won a scholarship that took him to Italy to study Italian medieval manuscripts. And this was the time when he wrote The Fury. And we notice that I think that he is in Italy, he's enthusiastic about the Italian milieu, the Italian surrounding, and he does a really good job of recreating the feeling of a small fishing town on the coast across from the Isle of Capri.
It was on the Isle of Capri that I found her, beneath the shade of an old walnut tree. Oh, I can still see the flowers blooming around her, where we met.
So The Fury was written in 1853, and in the following year something quite remarkable and important in his life happened. The King of Bavaria, Maximilian II, offered him a position, a paid position as a poet. Maximilian liked to gather around him poets and scientists, and so he was willing to pay 1,000 gulden per year at the time. That was a fair amount of money to give to someone to just sit around and write poems. It's probably equivalent to something like 40,000 Canadian dollars today. Not bad. And so this young poet, 24 years old, was seen at court with equal status as renowned scientists, well-known politicians. And from here, his star just continued to rise. Throughout his life, he made friends with some of the most famous poets of the day, and he was very highly regarded. He wrote many poems and novellas. He also wrote an autobiography. He wrote plays and novels. And he's also considered responsible for the reawakening of interest in Italian culture in Germany. When he died shortly before the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Germany had attained the political unification that he had been so enthusiastic about in his youth, but not in the way that it had been wanted in 1848. Because with the founding of the German Reich, das Deutsche Reich, the German kingdom, or the German Empire, in 1871. It was founded under Bismarck. It was not the same kind of democracy that was envisioned back in 1848. It's true, there was universal suffrage. Men did get the right to vote, and politically this was a big step forward, but it wasn't until 1919 that women had the vote in Germany. And for much of Europe this was quite progressive. Why am I talking about women having the right to vote? Denying the vote was justified by long-standing preconceptions about the nature of women. If we think of the Enlightenment as the driving intellectual force behind the political changes around the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, then the main argument, the main political argument here has to do with the power of reason. The power of reason is regarded as the force that's capable of overcoming the blind submission to tyranny, whether this be the tyranny of kings or the tyranny of churches. And Kant wrote about this in his foreword to the Critique of Pure Reason. In a way, this was why Kant undertook the project of exploring what reason could and couldn't do. It was to overcome blind superstition, blind following of tyrants. However, alongside the Enlightenment enthusiasm for reason, for the power of reason, there were underlying assumptions about what reason was and who could be reasonable, who was a reasonable creature, who wasn't. Men were regarded as custodians of reason, and women as natural beings, as creatures of the passions. This was so widespread that the argument for women having the right to vote was put way in the background because they weren't considered to be creatures of reason. So maybe you're starting to see the connection to Heyse's story now. Women are creatures of passion. Men are creatures of reason. Men are capable of reasoned political action. Women are not. And of course, women fought against this. Starting in 1848, we can name women like Louise Otto, who spoke out for women's right to vote. We can mention Hedwig Dohm, who in 1876 wrote a book called The Nature and Right of Women. The Nature and Right of Women. Why should men claim that women have a certain nature that excludes them from the law and from the right to vote, the right to be a citizen? And so there started to emerge throughout the 19th century this image of a new woman, a new political creature. And the image of new woman was met with quite a lot of anxiety on the part of men. And we see this reflected in really a lot of cultural products, a lot of writing, a lot of painting around the end of the 19th century. And I think it's also an interesting way to approach Heyse's story. So it's in this context that I would like you to think about The Fury. It's a story in which a beautiful young woman is marked by a deep-seated anger. And where does the anger come from? It comes from her personal experiences of domestic abuse. Abuse by her father of her mother. She was the first-hand witness, and she swore that she was never going to be abused in this way. This is the nature of her fury. And as we watch her anger develop and drive the plot, we can ask, what does Heyse think about the nature of women? How does he relate this anger, this fury, to the nature of woman? How does he relate it to gender? The answer might not be as easy as it first seems, and I think it's well worth trying to map the passions and reason onto gender in this story. And we can also ask, the two protagonists, this woman and this man, where do they sit among all the various different stereotypes of men as rational creatures, reasonable creatures, and women as passionate creatures. Men as creatures of culture, women as creatures of nature. Men as political creatures, women as creatures of the home. And also the ending. Is this a story with a happy ending? Is it? When we get to the ending of this story, what kind of a view of gender and action and morals, if you want to, what is right and what is wrong, what kind of a view has Heyse established? And then, in a way presiding over everything, there's the question of poverty. Poverty is a powerful driving force in this story. It's what brings men and women together, it's what creates bonds, and it's what makes the bonds perhaps tenuous, perhaps risky. It's also, in a way, what is capable of moderating the passions. So poverty is an important modifier of gender questions here. In fact, if we consider together the themes of poverty, religion, and the nature of men and women, it presents us with a kind of a puzzle at the end of the story. The story ends with the little curato hearing Lorella's confession. She's just risen from her knees, and saying to himself, well, who would have thought it that the Lord would take pity on this wayward little heart? And that he had been reproaching himself for not having adjured more sternly that ill demon of perversity, which presumably means Lorella's anger. Perverse because it goes against the nature of women. And he sees that God has put everything right by arranging this marriage. So this then does force us to ask certain questions about the nature of men and women. Alongside the stereotype of men being reasonable and women being emotional, we have the stereotype that men are active or aggressive and women are passive or tolerant. And in many ways the story questions this, but perhaps in the end it just reinforces it. In any event, it forces us to ask what the nature of gendered individuals is. And we also have to ask about Lorella's remorse. Is it possible that she changes her mind because when she bites Antonio's hand, she starts to see her father in herself? Is what she sees the confusion of love and abuse? It's not certain. Also, what about the curato's judgment at the end? This story was written just 10 years after Marx wrote the famous lines that religion is the opium of the people. Has Heyse shown us a situation where this happy ending is really just religion acting as the opium of the people? So think about these issues, think about them in the context that I've very briefly outlined, bring them into your discussion, and you can also write about them in your contributions to the discussion board. With that, I will say goodbye, auf Wiedersehen, and we will have more next week.